Right now, somewhere between Washington and Tehran, there is a quiet corridor that most Americans don't know exists. And the country holding that corridor open is not France, not China, not the United Nations. It's Pakistan. While American news cycles have been dominated by troop deployments, Trump's Truth Social posts, and the back-and-forth drama of whether Iran is negotiating or not, the real action has been happening in Islamabad. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar publicly confirmed that US-Iran indirect talks are taking place through messages being relayed by Pakistan, with Turkey and Egypt extending their support to this initiative. And this is not theater. At a White House cabinet meeting, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff confirmed that the US had presented Iran, through Pakistan, as an intermediary, a 15-point action list that forms the framework for a peace deal. Think about what that means for a moment. The most powerful military force on Earth, currently engaged in active combat operations against Iran under something called Operation Epic Fury, is passing its peace terms through a third country because it has no direct line of communication with Tehran. And that third country, Pakistan, has just stepped into one of the most consequential diplomatic roles on the planet. This is not a small story. This is the story of how wars end, how power actually moves in the world, and why the country you least expect is often the one that changes everything. To understand why Pakistan is sitting at this table, you have to slow down and look at the architecture of what's happening beneath the surface. Since the launch of Operation Epic Fury, the US-Israeli air campaign that began in late February 2026 and killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei within days, Islamabad has quietly but deeply inserted itself into the crisis, working the phones and holding meetings with key regional actors. Now that's a sentence worth reading twice. Iran lost its supreme leader in the opening weeks of this conflict. Ali Khamenei, the man who defined Iran's resistance posture for over 3 decades, was killed in the early days of a campaign that Washington is now describing as a military triumph. And yet, here we are, weeks later, and the war hasn't ended cleanly. Iran is still standing, still fighting in its asymmetric way, and still controlling the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow choke point through which a substantial portion of the world's oil flows. And that is the central tension of this entire drama. Trump won militarily, or so his team claims. But the geopolitical problem hasn't been solved. You can bomb a country into submission on the battlefield and still not get what you actually need from it, economically and strategically. So enter Pakistan. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has spoken repeatedly to Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir has held at least one direct call with President Donald Trump. Both Sharif and Munir have also traveled to Saudi Arabia. Now pay attention to that combination of relationships, because it tells you something profound about why Pakistan is uniquely positioned here. You've got the Pakistani Prime Minister speaking directly to the Iranian President, you've got the Pakistani Army Chief on the phone with Donald Trump, and you've got both of them traveling to Saudi Arabia, which has its own enormous stake in how this ends. Pakistan is simultaneously inside the confidence of the Americans, the Iranians, and the Gulf states. That is an extraordinarily rare position to occupy in a war zone, and it didn't happen by accident. Trump had previously told the media that Pakistanis know Iran very well, better than most. A few weeks later, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio praised Pakistan for its willingness to play a role as mediator with Iran. What's behind that trust? Part of it is bureaucratic and structural. Islamabad represents Tehran's diplomatic interests in Washington. That means Pakistan has been the de facto go-between for Iran and the United States even before this war began. When Iran needs something communicated to Washington through official channels, it goes through Islamabad. That institutional relationship, quiet and unglamorous as it is, becomes absolutely priceless the moment two countries are at war with each other and have no direct communication line. Pakistan didn't build this role overnight, it's been maintaining it for years, and now that role is paying off in ways that could shape the future of the entire Middle East. But there's another layer to this that goes even deeper. Qamar Chima, the executive director of the Islamabad-based Sanoba Institute, told NPR that US envoy Steve Witkoff has a direct connection to Field Marshal General Asim Munir, Pakistan's army chief, and that they have a good working relationship. Pakistan has also engaged with Witkoff's son, Zach, on cryptocurrency issues, including recently signing a memorandum of understanding with one of the younger Witkoff's ventures. Now I want you to think about what that means in practical terms. In diplomacy, trust is not institutional. trust is personal, and when the person doing the actual negotiating for the United States, Steve Witkoff, has a personal relationship with the man who commands Pakistan's military, that is the kind of connection that makes secret channels possible. It's the kind of relationship that allows a phone call to happen at 2 in the morning without any press release, without any announcement, without any diplomatic protocol getting in the way. Real diplomacy happens between people who trust each other. Pakistan has built those personal relationships across both sides of this conflict, and that is genuinely remarkable. Now let's talk about what's actually on the table, because this is where things get complicated and where most media coverage goes shallow when it should go deep. The 15-point US proposal has been delivered through Pakistan to Iran, and Iran is deliberating upon it. Iran countered with its own 5 conditions for ending the war, including war reparations and rights over the Strait of Hormuz for Iran. Let that sink in. Iran, a country that by Washington's own account has been militarily devastated, that has lost its supreme leader, that has seen its ballistic missile and drone capacity reduced by around 90% according to the White House, is still demanding reparations and sovereignty recognition over one of the world's most critical waterways. That is not the posture of a country that believes it has lost. That is the posture of a country that believes it still has leverage. And the reason Iran believes that is because it does. The Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed. Iranian media reported that Iran's parliament is pursuing a plan to formally codify Iran's sovereignty, control, and oversight over the Strait of Hormuz, while also creating a source of revenue through the collection of fees. They're not just closing the strait, they're trying to institutionalize control over it permanently. That is a breathtaking geopolitical ambition for a country in the middle of a war it is supposedly losing. The initial discussions being facilitated by Pakistan have been focused on finding a diplomatic solution to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which has been effectively closed by Iran since the beginning of the war and is now a key aim of President Donald Trump. This is the heart of everything. Not nuclear weapons, not regime change, not democracy, the Strait of Hormuz. Because the strait is where the economic reality of this conflict meets the geopolitical ambition. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that the other countries get far more of their fuel from the strait than the United States does. And that's exactly right. The European countries, the Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, India, China, they are all bleeding economically because of this closure. The longer the strait remains shut, the more pressure builds on every major economy in the world to find a resolution. Iran understands this. Iran is banking on the fact that global economic pain will eventually force a deal that gives Tehran something meaningful in return for reopening the waterway. Trump extended the deadline on Iran energy strikes by 10 days to April the 6th, citing what he described as a request from the Iranian government. Now, this is a fascinating moment, and it tells you a great deal about the real dynamic between these two countries right now. Trump framed this pause as a concession Iran requested. Iran's public posture has been to deny that negotiations are even taking place. Iran's top military spokesperson said on state television that no one like Iran would make a deal with the United States. Not now, not ever. And yet, the pause happened, and the pause was framed explicitly as a response to an Iranian request. So either Iran is negotiating and lying about it to its domestic audience, or the Trump administration is misrepresenting Iran's position to its own domestic audience. Both of those things can be partially true at the same time, and in diplomacy they usually are. What we know with certainty is that Pakistan is in the middle of it, relaying the actual substance back and forth while both sides perform their public theater. Trump said at a fundraising dinner that Iran wants to make a deal so badly but is afraid to say it because they figure they'll be killed by their own people. And there is something real in that observation, even if Trump is characteristically overstating his own winning position. The Iranian leadership is in a genuinely precarious domestic situation. The supreme leader is dead. The country has absorbed enormous military punishment. The economy was already struggling before this conflict, and the population is watching all of this unfold. Any deal that looks like capitulation to Washington could destabilize whatever political order remains in Tehran. So Iran has to negotiate in a way that doesn't look like negotiating. It has to get something it can present to its own people as a victory, or at least as a dignified outcome. And Pakistan, by keeping the talks indirect and off the official record, is giving Iran the cover it needs to engage without publicly surrendering. Iran's Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Kalibaf characterized the announcement of talks as a cover for US military action, writing that the enemy publicly signals negotiations while secretly planning a ground invasion, and warned that Iranian forces are ready for any US ground troops. An expeditionary force of 2,200 U.S. Marines arrived in the region, and 2,500 more Marines from the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit are on their way, with Trump also reportedly preparing to deploy 1,000 troops with the 8th 2nd Airborne Division. So we have this extraordinary and deeply dangerous situation where diplomatic backchannels are active and fragile, while military escalation is simultaneously continuing. Trump is negotiating with one hand and deploying Marines with the other. Trump is reportedly considering an operation to capture Karg Island, a strategic oil hub 15 miles off Iran's coast that processes 90% of its crude oil exports. If that operation proceeds, any possibility of a negotiated settlement through Pakistan or anyone else evaporates instantly. You cannot capture a country's main oil export terminal and simultaneously expect that country to sit down and discuss peaceful terms. These two tracks are on a collision course, and the question is which one wins before April 6th. Pakistan's role is not new. It brokered the secret US-China Backchannel in 1971, was a key interlocutor in the Geneva Accords that helped end the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s, facilitated talks that led to the 2020 Doha Agreement, and has across successive governments attempted to mediate between Saudi Arabia and Iran. When you look at that historical record, what you see is a country that has consistently understood something that larger powers often miss, that geography and relationships, properly cultivated, can be converted into diplomatic leverage that outlasts any single military or economic advantage. Pakistan is not a great power by conventional metrics. It has a struggling economy, enormous domestic challenges, its own border conflicts, and a complicated political history, but it keeps showing up at these pivotal moments because it has built something that money and military force cannot simply buy: credibility with parties on opposite sides of fundamental divides. A former Pakistani ambassador to China noted that Pakistan's story is told most often through the prism of conflict, yet beneath the headlines of coups, crises, and border skirmishes runs a quieter, more consistent thread, a state that has repeatedly tried to turn its geography and Muslim world ties into diplomatic leverage for peace. That framing is important because it cuts against how most Americans think about Pakistan, which is through the lens of the war on terror, through the complicated relationship around Afghanistan, through the questions about nuclear proliferation. All of those things are real and they matter, but they exist alongside this other Pakistan, the one that has been quietly making itself indispensable to the resolution of conflicts that the great powers cannot solve through their conventional tools. Pakistan's prime mediation role amplifies a contradiction that has played out for months. The country enjoying an extended geopolitical moment in the sun, even as it continues to suffer from cascading challenges at home. De-escalation in the Iran war can't come soon enough for South Asia, as it grapples with severe energy shortages and other bad economic consequences. And this is the part of the story that doesn't get told enough. Pakistan is not doing this purely out of altruism or global statesmanship. It is doing this because it needs this war to end. Pakistan imports enormous amounts of energy from the Middle East. Pakistani workers in the Gulf send home remittances that are critical to the country's foreign exchange. Pakistan's closest allies are the Gulf states. Every week this war continues is another week of economic bleeding for a country that cannot afford to bleed much more. Pakistan's diplomacy here is an act of strategic self-interest wrapped in the language of regional stability, and that is exactly how sustainable diplomacy usually works. Countries don't mediate conflicts out of pure goodwill. They mediate when they have skin in the game. What we are witnessing right now in real time is a test of whether the old tools of statecraft, the quiet backchannel, the trusted third party, the message relayed in confidence, can survive in an era of truth social posts and 24-hour news cycles where everything leaks and nothing stays secret for long. An official in Islamabad, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed that Pakistan's interior minister held a secret meeting with the Iranian ambassador in Pakistan. That kind of meeting used to happen in total darkness. Now we know about it within days because the information ecosystem is simply too porous, and that porousness creates its own pressures. When Iran's leaders can read on Twitter that their government is supposedly negotiating, while simultaneously telling their parliament that they will never negotiate, that contradiction becomes politically dangerous inside Iran in ways that make the actual diplomacy harder. Pakistan is trying to hold a secret channel together in conditions that make secrecy nearly impossible, and the fact that it is still functioning at all is a testament to the relationships Islamabad has spent years building. The April 6th deadline is the next pressure point. Witkoff told cabinet members that if Iran can be convinced that this is the inflection point with no good alternatives other than more death and destruction, there are strong signs a deal is a possibility. That is not the language of a side that is certain it will get what it wants. That is the language of a side that is hoping its read of the adversary's psychology is correct while knowing it might not be. And whether that read is correct, whether Iran's leadership will decide that accepting a deal through Pakistan's quiet corridor is better than holding out for better terms while the military pressure intensifies, that is the question that will define the next phase of this crisis. Pakistan is the messenger, but the message itself, whether it carries the seeds of peace or the prelude to deeper war, is still being written in the halls of power in Washington and Tehran by leaders who are each telling their own people stories about winning while quietly trying to find a door out.